In the 6th episode of this tutorial series, we'll be tackling the animation for our portal. By the time we're done, we'll have a fully animated, seamless loop. If you find yourself enjoying this tutorial, consider checking out my premium classes on Skillshare. I'm excited that I can offer everyone a completely free month of premium Skillshare membership by using the link in the description and comments below. I have 9 unique classes focused on many different aspects of Blender, like my Model a Gummy Bear class. With that out of the way, let's proceed with the tutorial. We're going to start by animating the shape of our portal. We'll be adding a simple modifier that deforms the portal and creates a subtle pulsing animation. First, let's make sure our timeline at the bottom is set to end on 300 frames. This will make sure that our animation is 10 seconds long due to the 30 frames per second we set for the animation in the first episode. We can easily change that by going down here to the bottom right on the timeline, and where it says end, we're just going to type in 300 and then hit enter. Now would also be a good time to make the timeline a little bit taller, so we can just click down here where our mouse between the border of these two viewports. Wait until it turns into a vertical arrow, and then we can just pull this up so we can see more of the timeline. Now hovering over this timeline, hit the home key on your keyboard, which is located directly above the arrow keys towards the right side between the main keyboard and your numpad. So if you hit that, it'll just center out this so you can see all 300 frames. Now you can select the portal and then go to your modifier tab, the little blue wrench icon. And we're going to be adding a new modifier. So we'll go up here to add modifier, and we're going to choose simple deform. It's over here in the third column. Now let's scroll down in our modifier list. And then we're going to be changing some of these settings. But first, let's just kind of see what it did by default. So on our right viewport here, I'm just going to rotate around, and you can see it kind of bent this into sort of like a potato chip shape or something. I'm not exactly sure how to describe this. I guess it kind of twisted it and spun it. So we're going to be using this in order to make our portal kind of have an overall kind of wobbly, warpy shape in addition to the already wavy edge. Let's start by switching the type of deform it's using. Right now it's defaulted to twist. We're going to switch ours to stretch instead. So we can see after switching it to stretch, it's changed the way it's deformed it. It's now has no more forward and backward movement, so it's perfectly flat again, but it's changed it into almost this kind of squished square shape. We can affect how much it's changing the shape of our portal by affecting the factor slider down here. So if we have it set to 0, that's basically exactly what it was. And then we can go negative, and we can also go positive. And we can see here it's just kind of giving it this sort of like jelly, kind of wobbly shape to it. So you can see how if we animated this, we could give our portal just some subtle kind of pulsating movement back and forth, as we eventually will make this texture in the center spin, and we'll get a kind of more complex movement. Now we can begin placing keyframes on our timeline to animate this stretch deformation. Keyframes tell Blender to make sure a parameter is set to a certain value by a specific point in time. As you place keyframes, Blender will animate between the values that you have keyframed, causing the object to change over time. So let's start this process now. We'll start by going down here to the bottom on our timeline, and we're going to click and drag this blue line here called the playhead, and we're going to move it all the way over to frame 0. Now over here on the modifier, we're going to set the factor to 0, hit enter, so that'll kind of get it back to the baseline shape that it started out as. And then we're going to click this tiny little white dot here to place a keyframe on frame 0 with the factor set to 0. So we're just going to click this little dot here. We can see now it's turned into a diamond, and the value is yellow, and that corresponds to this yellow diamond down here, also set for the factor to be 0. Now don't get confused the fact that it's on frame 0 and we set it to 0. That's just a coincidence. We could have set this to 1000 or 10 or 15 or whatever we wanted to, and that wouldn't have changed the fact that it was on frame 0. This is just the point in time that we're placing this value. Now let's place a second keyframe, because by default a single keyframe doesn't really do anything. We haven't told it to change because there aren't 2 different values. So let's drag the playhead now to frame 75. Right here, and then we're going to change the factor to negative 0.2 and then hit enter. Now we'll see that the number here is orange, and we also don't have a keyframe on our timeline. And that's because we haven't clicked this little empty diamond symbol now. So if we click this, now we can see the number goes back to being yellow, which is letting you know that you have placed a keyframe. And now there is a keyframe here on the timeline. So now if you click and drag this playhead and you move it back and forth between these two yellow dots, you can see the portal here kind of stretching out and getting a little taller and also a little thinner. So that's essentially how these keyframes are working. You place a keyframe here, in this case at 0 on frame 0. And then we've placed another keyframe here at frame 75. And we've keyframed it at -0.2 factor. And then if you watch that number as you move between these points, it's just going from one number to the next number. So if we placed another keyframe over here, which we're about to do, it's going to animate from the last value we had set, in this case frame 75 at -0.2, and then it's going to animate to the next value that we set. So our next keyframe we're going to place at frame 150. So move your playhead here to frame 150. Go to your factor. We're going to type in 0 again. So 0 factor. Again, it's turned orange, letting us know that we have changed the value, but we haven't actually changed the keyframe yet. Or we haven't added a keyframe, rather. So once we've changed it back to 0, we can click this little empty diamond now to place that keyframe. So now we can see that we've basically just animated it up to 0.2, and then we're animating it back down to 0. And we're just going to do that 2 more times here along this timeline, so that over the course of this animation, the portal just kind of stretches vertically, and then it settles back into the original shape. So it's just going to have sort of like you could almost think of it as like a breathing animation. So it's taking an inhale here, and then it's exhaling again. Now let's move to frame 225. So right here, 225. We're going to type in -0.2, hit enter, and then we'll click the keyframe button to place the keyframe. And then one last time, we're going to go to frame 300, set our factor to 0, hit enter, and then place our keyframe. Now before we hit the play button here to preview this animation, let's make a few changes here so that the animation plays a little bit smoother. So we're going to go over here to our left viewport, and then we're going to change the rendered viewport mode that it's currently using. So again, if you can't see these buttons here, just click in your middle mouse button on this top bar, and that allows you to pan it around. So pan it all the way to the left so you can see the buttons on the furthest right. And we're going to switch it to the material preview view. So once you click this, it'll load for a second. So now it's loaded in. And this will allow us to play the animation. It's still seeing our textures, just not in quite of a nice light as they were before, but it'll play a lot more smooth. If you'd like this to look a little bit closer to what the actual animation looks like, we can go up here to the drop down next to these buttons. We can twirl that open, and then we can check on these 2 buttons. So right now it's using this as the default lighting. So it's just giving it kind of a ambient, kind of looks like a woods or a forest or a park lighting. So if we check these buttons on, it will instead use the lights that we have placed in the scene. And it'll also use the scene world, which in our case is black. So when we check both of those on, it looks a lot more similar to what it was before. But this will still play significantly faster than this mode here. Now this mode looks a little bit better, there's better reflections, but if we switch back to our material preview, you can see it doesn't look that much different, but this will still play much faster. So now let's go down here and hit the play button, and we can preview this animation. So we can see now our animation kind of, the portal itself is actually kind of stretching out and has, like I said, it almost mimics like a breathing animation. Now depending on how the shape of your portal was randomized, this -0.2 value might be a little bit too tall. So in my case, it almost looks like it's touching the bottom here and here at the top as well. So if you want to change that, all you have to do is hover over the keyframe that you want to adjust. In my case, it's the 75 keyframe. And I can go over here to this value and I can just change this number here. So I'm going to change this to, say, we'll do 0.15 instead of 0.2. See how that looks. That's probably still a little bit too much, so I'll make mine down to 0.1. Okay, so that's a little bit more subtle now. But you also notice that it hasn't changed this number to yellow. And that's because we've changed the value, but the keyframe sitting on this frame 75 is still using the 0.2, and that's because we haven't updated the keyframe. So to update it, we need to turn off the keyframe and then turn it back on to replace that new keyframe. Essentially what we've done is deleted the old one and then replaced it with the new one. So now this number down here is yellow, which means that's actually the currently keyframed value. And then let's change the next one, which was 225. I'm going to set this to 0.1, just like the other. Hit enter. And then again, just click this keyframe button twice. Depending on the shape of your portal, you might not have needed to do this step, but I wanted mine to be a little bit more subtle than it was. So now I can hit play and just see how this breathing animation works. So it's a little bit more subtle now because overall the amount of movement between the steps is also smaller. There's one last thing I wanted to explain here before we move to the next animation piece. And that's the fact that we started this animation on frame 0 and then ended on frame 300. However, if we look over here, our frames don't actually start until 1. So when we start rendering this, when we render our full animation, it's going to skip frame 0. It won't actually see this one. It's going to start rendering frame 1 and then render through all the way up to frame 300. This might seem like a mistake on my part, but it's actually necessary for it to loop seamlessly. And the reason that is because if we have this exact same number, so in this case we have factor set to 0 on frame 0, and then factor set to 0 on frame 300, if we had this first frame on frame 1, the very first frame and the very last frame would actually be identical. So we would have 2 repeated frames back to back where the portal doesn't move at all. And that might seem like a really subtle thing, but if you want it to be a perfectly seamless loop, you need to chop off that very first still frame. Now that we understand the basics of animation, let's move on to the next piece, in this case, the portal bubbles. We'll be doing a similar effect with the bubbles, however we'll be laying 2 simple deforms on top of each other to make the movement a bit more complex. So first let's select the portal bubbles. We can select any one of them because they're all attached. Now over here in our modify panel, we can choose add modifier and then choose simple deform. On this first deform, we're going to switch it to the taper mode instead of stretch like we did last time. So we have it set to taper. And then we're going to go to factor 0 for our first keyframe. So factor 0. And then before you place your keyframe, just make sure that your playhead here is on frame 0. That's where the first keyframe is going to be placed. Okay, we're on frame 0. We have our factor set to 0. Now we can just click the little keyframe button. Let's place the next keyframe. We can go up to frame 150. So we're going to be placing less keyframes for this. So right in the middle, frame 150. We can change our factor to 0.25 and then hit enter. Now we can place the keyframe here just by clicking this little empty diamond. So now we have our keyframe placed. And then one last keyframe right on frame 300. We're going to set our factor back to 0. Hit enter. And then click the keyframe button. Now let's hit play to see how it looks. So we can hit our play button here. And we can see our portal bubbles here. They kind of deform a little bit, they change shape, they move around, but it's all really slow and subtle. It just gives us kind of like a floating, kind of ethereal look. Let's add another deform on top of this one to make the movement a little bit more complex. Again, if we go over here to our modifier panel, we can click add modifier, and we're going to add another simple deform directly on top of the old one. We can see down here the second one was added just below it. So let's move our playhead back to 0. We're on frame 0 now. We're going to switch it to the mode stretch for this one. And then we can set our factor to 0. And then hit enter. Now let's place this 0 factor keyframe by clicking the little dot. We can again move it up to frame 75 this time. We're going to set our factor to 0.2. Hit enter. And then we can click our keyframe dot here. Now we can go to frame 150. Change our factor to 0. Hit enter. Place our keyframe. And then again 225. factor set to 0.2, hit enter, place our keyframe, and then one last time, frame 300, set our factor to 0, and then place our keyframe. Now let's hit play to preview this new animation. This effect is a little less subtle than the first one, so you might want to maybe diminish it by lowering the numbers. It's also pretty heavily reliant on where your portal bubbles are in relation to your portal. So if your portal bubbles are a little bit further out, it's going to be a more exaggerated movement. So it might be something where you need to reconsider where your portal bubbles are placed, and you need to move them in a little bit closer to your portal, or keep them away from stones that they may or may not be running into, or we can just lessen the effect of this modifier so that the movement isn't quite so exaggerated to begin with. In my case, I think I'm going to just make the modifier a little less strong, so I'm going to lower the influence of it so it doesn't move everything around quite so much. We can do this process just like last time by finding the keyframe that we want to adjust. In this case, I'm going to lower the frame 75 keyframe. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to lower this down to 0.1 this time, so I'm just halving the effect. And we can see immediately the amount of change it's made in the movement. Once I have the number changed, I can just click this twice to delete the old one, and then again to place the new one. And then I'll go to the next keyframe, which was also set to 0.2. So in this case, frame 225. And I'm going to set this to 0.1 for the factor. Click the button once to delete the old keyframe, and then again to place the new one. So now if I hit play, I can reevaluate this movement. This movement's a lot more subtle than the last one, but there's probably still some changes we can make. Now let's actually go into the portal bubble, and we can move around individual portal bubbles to make sure that they don't animate quite as much as they are now. So I'm going to stop my animation. Then I'm going to go to one of the frames where the factor is set to 0.1, so either frame 75 or frame 225. Now over here on my right viewport, I'm going to hit Tab to enter my edit mode. We can see when we do that, we actually see two versions of each of these portal bubbles. So the one where we're seeing it where it's just kind of like a wireframe, that's where the portal bubble is actually placed before the modifier is moving it. And then the one we see here where it's kind of stretched out and moved off to the side, that's where the effect of the modifier is moving it to. So I'm going to hit Alt and Z to go into my X-ray mode over here. And then I'm going to hit 1 to go into my vertex mode. And then I can just drag select over one of the portal bubbles that I want to move. I'm going to select this one. And then you can see as I move this around, it will change like where this modifier version will end up. So I can see as I move it closer to the portal, it actually stretches it less and it keeps it closer to the original position. As I move it further out, it moves it further. So I need to find some positions here where it doesn't move quite as drastically as it was before. And we have to remember wherever we place this version of it, that's where it's going to be on the other keyframes. So it'll be wherever the wireframe is set to on the sort of the even keyframes or the odd keyframes, and then every other one, it'll switch to this position. So I'm going to move mine up to roughly here. This is all just kind of doing it by eye. So I'm relatively happy with this. Now I can select this keyframe, or this portal bubble here, and then move this up. And I'm going to have to move this one a good bit closer so it doesn't move quite as much. Right about here. So this is going to be something you have to kind of evaluate for each one of your portal bubbles, because I'm sure you placed them roughly, different positions than I did. So if you have any that are moving a really large amount, you're going to have to evaluate each of them individually. But I think that amount of movement for each of these is probably fine. So now I'm going to go over to the other side. I'm going to zoom out here. And then select each of these. These actually move a good bit less than the others do. So I'm going to move these around just to see how it affects the movement. But in most cases here, I think these are actually probably fine. So I'm going to leave those right where they're at now. Okay, so now that I've moved my portal bubbles, I'm not going to touch any of these. I can just hit Tab to exit this, and then Alt-Z to exit the X-ray mode. And now I can hit play to see how that's affected it. Now that I see it in motion, I'm happy with the smaller bubble here, but I'm not quite so happy with the larger one. So I'm going to pause this, go back to the same frame I was at, 225. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that movement now. It's a lot more subtle than it was before we actually moved the portal bubbles. And that's just by changing the position. We've changed how this modifier interacts with them. So now let's move on to the last piece of this animation. And this is going to be a little bit different than the last two. To animate our portal stones surrounding our portal, we're going to be going through a process that's a bit different than the first two animations we just did. And that's because we won't be using any modifiers to make these keyframes. We're going to be using a tool called auto keying. So to start, let's go into our front view by either clicking the -y bubble or hitting tilde and then choosing front. Now let's zoom in here so we can see all the portal stones. We're not quite so concerned about anything else, so as long as you can see the portal stones, you're fine. As I mentioned, we're going to be using a tool called auto keying. This will automate the process of creating keys for us by simply placing a keyframe every time we change the position, rotation, or scale of an object. Now for the portal stones, we're not going to want to key every single one of those parameters. We're really only going to be keying the position, so let's limit it to just the position for the auto key. We can do that by going down here to where it says keying. We can click this drop down menu. And then at the top where it shows this blank field, we can click on this. And then we can choose location. So basically, if you choose any one of these options, it will key any one of those parameters. So we can have it just set to location, rotation, or scale, or we can have location and rotation, or any combination that it shows here. So in our case, we're going to choose just location because that's all we really want it to place keyframes on. You don't really want to be placing keyframes for values that you don't intend on animating. It makes your animation a bit more messy and hard to edit. Let's start animating the top portal stone like we usually do. So we're going to go to the very top center here. We're going to go down here on our timeline and switch it to frame 0. And then over here on the right side, we're going to switch to the Object Properties tab. It's this little orange box with the brackets around it. Now to start with, we're going to want to place an initial keyframe, kind of locking in its current position. And to do that, we can just go over here and hover over any one of these location values, so be it X, Y, or Z, and just hit I on your keyboard. And that will place an initial keyframe for all three of these values on frame 0. Now let's enable our auto key. And to do this, we can go down here to this little white circle next to our play buttons. We can just click this and that will enable auto key. One last thing we need to do though is hit this little drop down arrow and then choose only active keying set. So when we check this, that means it will actually look at this active keying set, which is currently set to location. If you don't have this checked on, it's just going to ignore the fact that we told it to only key location. So from now on that we have auto key on, whenever we move an object, it will automatically keyframe its new location wherever the playhead is currently at. And now we're going to move it just in the Z direction, up a relatively small amount. So in my case, I'm going to move it up to about here. So it was about 0.13 meters. So maybe 0.15 if you wanted to actually type a number in here. So 0.15 meters is how much I moved it up just in the Z direction. We can also notice down here, it's placed a keyframe automatically for us just of the location values on frame 75, and that's because we had auto keying turned on. We want the stone to move a relatively small amount so that as it animates, they appear to slowly float towards and away from the portal. We're kind of mimicking that breathing animation that we did with the modifier on the portal itself. Now let's move our playhead here to frame 150. And we're going to move it roughly back to where it was. Now it doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be roughly back to the original position it was in. So I'm going to move mine back down. And I can double check down here. So in this case, it's negative 0.149, which is remarkably close to negative 0.15, which is what it should have been. So if you really want to, you can type in the actual value. So you can type in negative 0.15 and then hit enter, and now it's exactly where it used to be. But again, this doesn't have to be perfect, so don't worry about typing in the number in here unless making it perfect is what makes you happy. We can also see again that the auto key worked and placed a keyframe here just on the location for us automatically. Now let's move our playhead here to frame 225. And we're going to again move it up, and this time we want to move it roughly to where it was before, so roughly 0.15 meters upward in the Z direction. This again does not need to be perfect, but if you'd like to, you can just type in the value. So you can just move it up in sort of arbitrary amount. And then once you see this box pop up here, you can type in 0.15 and then hit enter. And now it's an identical position to where it was before on frame 75. And now our last keyframe, we're going to be placing this on frame 300. Now I'm going to show you how to do this if you weren't following along and making it perfect by typing the actual number in. Again, you didn't have to. So to make sure that this last keyframe is identical to the very first one so that it loops perfectly, so that it runs right into the next one and you can't tell where the animation starts and ends, we can actually duplicate keyframes. So to do this, I'm just going to click on any empty spot in the keyframe or in the timeline to deselect all my keyframes. They're now gray because they're not selected. Now I can drag select over this keyframe, the very first one, and then hit Shift and D to duplicate, and that will duplicate this keyframe. We can move it all the way over here to frame 300 and then click, and now we've made an exact duplicate of the first keyframe on the last frame of this animation. This ensures that as our animation plays, when it hits the end of the animation, you won't notice like a quick jump where the position of that stone wasn't perfect. It'll be exactly where it should have been right at the end so that it seamlessly plays directly into the beginning of the animation again. Now that we have that first stone animated, let's hit the play button and just get a visual of what it looks like. So we can see here, it kind of mimics this breathing animation that we have set on the portal itself. So it moves up and down kind of along with the portal. With the first stone done, we now need to mimic this process on every one of these other portal stones. So I'm going to zoom out here. I can select the second one. We can see as soon as we select this one, our keyframes disappear. And that's because it's only showing the keyframes of the selected object. So if you ever forget where you need to be placing your keyframe so that it matches the other, just select on one of these objects that is already keyframed, in this case this top stone, and you can see what numbers that you should be placing your new keyframes on. So let's go to frame 0, select the new stone. We can now hover over the location for this and hit I to place an initial keyframe. And now let's go to frame 75, just like the last stone. And let's zoom in a bit here. So this process is going to be a little bit different than the last one, and that's because you'll notice here our gizmo doesn't just go with the direction of the stone itself. And that's because the stone has been rotated. However, this gizmo is just showing the world orientation. Now luckily we can change that. And the way we can change it is by going up here to where it says orientation. Right now it's set to default. We're going to switch that to local. So you'll notice right as we choose local, this has rotated this gizmo so now it's in line with the actual stone itself. So this will make the animation process much easier on us. I'm going to quickly walk you through the process again for the second stone now that we're doing this local movement. But after the second stone, I'll be speeding up the video to finish the rest of my stones, and I suggest you do the same. But for now, let's quickly walk through the second stone animation. So move your frame to frame 0, your playhead. We're going to move it out slightly. And in this case, I'm just kind of visually looking at what would make a contiguous circle. If I kind of bridge these gaps between these with my eyes, where would this stone need to be to kind of fix that circle? So roughly about here. And since we have auto keying on, it's automatically placed our keyframe. Now let's move to frame 150. I'm not going to worry about making this exact like the first stone, so I'm just going to move it back down roughly to where it used to be. Okay, it's placed our keyframe at 150. Now 225 frame. Move it back roughly to where it used to be. Right about here. And then move my playhead to 300. And this time I'm not going to just move it here. I'm going to duplicate the last keyframe. So I can click off to deselect all of the keyframes down here. Just click anywhere where there is no keyframe currently. Drag select over the first keyframe on frame 0. hit Shift and D to start duplicating. And we're going to duplicate it all the way over here to frame 300, and then click, and now that will place that duplicate. Now if I hit play on my animation, I can see that it animates along with this other stone. They both have that sort of breathing animation that I keep mentioning. Okay, so I'm going to finish the rest of my stones in my animation, and I suggest you pause the video, catch up, and then I'll see you in a moment. Okay, great. So we're done animating the portal stones now. We can just hit play down here to see what it looks like with all of them animating all at the same time now. So we can see it just kind of mimics this breathing animation that I've mentioned for the 1000th time at this point. So I think everything looks good. We have a lot of like nice subtle animation here going on in the portal bubbles and the portal stones kind of moving with it. And then the portal itself kind of pulsating and moving. So I'm going to stop the animation here. And then there's two things we want to remember to turn off now. So first we're going to go up here with our move tool selected. And where it says orientation local that we were using for all of these portal stones, I'm just going to switch this back to default. And then lastly, very importantly, probably the most important thing here, is turn off your auto key. You don't want it to be just automatically keying things that you select and then move around. So just check this to turn it gray again, and that means auto key is now off. And now we have just one last thing to animate, and that's actually the texture on the portal itself. So we're going to be making this spin around in a circle, as well as kind of mimic that pulsating motion as well. To do this, we need to go up to our shading tab. So we're going to switch over here to our shading workspace like we were in before. We can now switch over to the material preview on the top. So we can click on this material preview button, and we're going to click on this drop down button here, and then again check on scene lights and scene world, so we can see a bit better approximation of what it actually looks like. Lastly, just click on your camera button here to get a view from your camera perspective. And then we can just zoom in and out here to recenter this so we can see the whole view. Now in the top viewport, we're going to select the portal, and then we're going to zoom out. And then we're also going to click on the wave texture node here. So we have both the portal itself selected, as well as the actual node for the wave texture selected as well. In order to actually see our animation here though, we need to make a timeline. And currently we do not have a timeline created on this viewport. So let's drag one in now. And we can create one just by going down here to the bottom left, so right above the scroll bar, and then wait until your mouse turns into a plus sign and just click and drag and pull up to make a brand new viewport. And then we can click this little circle icon here, and this will change what this viewport is showing. So in our case, we want it to show the timeline. So we can click that. By choosing this, it's just going to show a slightly more kind of in-depth version of the timeline we were using before, but in reality, it's basically the same thing. It's just showing more parameters. If you'd like to see more of this timeline at the bottom, we can reposition these windows by making some smaller, so we can see a little bit more of what's actually going on down here. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit on this so I can see the full portal. The first thing we're going to keyframe is the phase offset parameter here on the wave texture. So let's go to frame 0. We'll make sure our phase offset is set to 0 as well. And then we're just going to hover over it and hit I to place a keyframe. We can see it's turned yellow. And now down here we have a new category that we can open up. We can scroll down, we can keep opening it up until we see default value wave texture, and this is actually the specific keyframe that we placed for this phase offset value. Now one important thing to notice is that if we click off of this wave texture, this will actually disappear. It looks like it's not keyframed anymore. So to see the keyframes for this, we need to make sure we actually have the node selected to view the keyframe. Now we can move to our next location on the timeline. We're going to move to frame 150. We can set the phase offset to 5, hit enter, and then we can hit I again while hovering over this value to manually place our keyframe. And then lastly, we move to frame 300, change the phase offset back to 0, hit enter, and then hit I on top of this value to place our keyframe. Now let's hit the play button here to see what we actually did. So after we hit play, we can now see the portal itself is actually animating this texture on it. It's not just the physical portal itself moving, the texture on it is also moving. And it has this kind of, again, for lack of a better word, because I can't think of anything more different, is breathing. So it kind of looks like it's inhaling and exhaling. The portal lines are moving in, and they're kind of changing shape as they do so, and then they eventually move back out to meet the original frame that we started with. So while this is already looking much better, there is one more effect that I'd like to add. So we can pause our animation, and now we're going to click on this mapping node over here. So when we click this, we're going to lose the view of the keyframes. They're still there, so if you move back and forth, your portal is still animating its phase. We just can't see the keyframes because we don't have that node selected. So I'm going to move over here to frame 0. And the thing we're going to be animating over here is the rotation of the portal. So it's actually going to start looking like it's spinning now instead of just breathing in and out. So with your playhead here set to 0, we're going to hit I on the rotation for the Z axis. So hit I here, and that'll rotate, or that'll keyframe rather, all the rotations in this case. Now we can move our playhead to frame 300. And then for the Z, we're going to type in 360, hit enter, and then hit I again to keyframe that. Down here at the bottom, let's just clean this up a little bit. We don't need this X or the Y keyframes at all, because we're not actually keyframing anything. It just keyframed them 0 to 0, which is why we're seeing this orange line between them. It's just letting us know that between these two keyframes, nothing has changed. So it's just kind of connecting them. So we're just going to drag select over the X and the Y value here. And then we can hit delete. And that'll just remove them. They weren't doing anything for us other than kind of cluttering this view. So there's no point in letting them there. Now that they're deleted, we can now hit the play button here and we can watch what it's done to our portal. So now we can see our portal is not only breathing in and out, it's also spinning around. So it has this kind of whirlpool effect going on, which looks pretty cool. However, we'll notice that right there at the very end, the spinning isn't kind of as seamless as everything else is. It kind of starts out slow. So right there it goes slow, and now it speeds up. So it's really obvious where the animation starts and stops. Now, luckily, again, this is something we can easily fix. So let's pause our viewport, or pause our animation rather. And then up here at the top, we're going to click and drag to make this viewport much larger. We don't really need to see much of this right now. And we're going to make a new viewport here on the top. So I'm going to start over here on the right side. I'm going to click and drag from the top corner when my mouse turns into a plus sign. Drag out a new viewport. Now I can zoom this one in here so I can see my camera a bit better. And then over here on the right side, I'm going to click this drop down to change the type of viewport that it is. And we're going to switch this to the graph editor. Over on this new viewport, the graph editor, we can hit N to hide this side menu. It's only taking up space and we won't really need it. And now let's hit the home key, which will recenter all of this and allow us to see everything in this graph editor. So what we're concerned with here is actually this Z value. So if we just click on this, it'll highlight that line, so it's a bit easier to see. And what we're concerned with is this S curve that we're seeing. So we can see it's not a straight line. It kind of starts out and kind of curves low, then it accelerates up here, and then it starts kind of curving off and flattening off again. So this is basically giving you a visual representation of this keyframe. So the velocity of this keyframe, the speed at which it's moving, starts out pretty slow, and then it quickly speeds up, and then it slows back down again at the end. And that's because of the type of keyframe it places by default. These keyframes that we're seeing here with this S curve on them are considered Bezier keyframes. These Bezier keyframes that it makes by default do a good job of making our animation feel a little bit more smooth and less robotic, but it also sort of ruins some of these looping animations that we're making here by making slowdowns in the beginning and slowdowns at the end, so that's pretty obvious when the animation begins and ends. To fix this, we're going to start by clicking on this little eyeball here, and this will hide these keyframes down here. We don't want to accidentally affect those. So this just hides them so that we don't select them by accident. So with those hidden, We can now drag select over the beginning of this line, hold shift, and select over the end of the line. And now we have both keyframes selected on the graph editor. Now let's hit V on our keyboard. This will bring up the menu for the different types of handles for these keyframes. Currently what they're set to is it's aligned. So aligned is equivalent to Bezier. Depending on where you look in the interface, it's going to call it something different, but they're essentially the same thing. We need to switch ours to vector, and you can see the difference in the shape here. So vector lines will have no curvature to them. It'll just be a straight line from point A to point B, which means there will be no change in velocity or speed of the animation. So when we click this, we can see our line now is perfectly straight between these 2 points. There's no curvature in it. And that means that the speed remains consistent from the very beginning to the very end. This vector handle type is also considered a linear keyframe. So you might see it referred to as a linear keyframe elsewhere in the interface. Now let's hit our play button to see how that's made a difference to our animation. We can now notice that at the beginning and the end of the animation, the speed is identical from the beginning to the end. So there's no obvious slowdown or speed up in the middle. This makes sure that the loop is completely seamless and we don't know when the animation starts or stops. The only flicker you're seeing here is actually in the viewport. So if you notice your lights are it kind of looks like it's like redrawing the frame really quickly. That's not part of the animation. That's just the viewport not quite catching up to the animation resetting. So you won't actually see that in your final animation. With the speed of the rotation fixed, we're officially done animating the entire portal. In the next and final episode, we'll be doing some simple compositing within Blender and then rendering our final animation. I'll see you there. Don't forget to click the link in the description and comments below for a free month of Skillshare. Watch my classes as well as thousands of others across a wide variety of topics. For the sake of transparency, I do receive a small amount of money if you decide to continue your subscription after that first free month. I truly appreciate the support. If you're enjoying the tutorial series so far, like the video, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you're notified when I release new content just like this.